Hi, Drew.
Hey, Julie.
Yeah, I'm honored to have you here, and in general, I'm very grateful that you exist. And one of the reasons is that you undermine completely the whole metaphysical project and the whole thing that claims that existence is grounded in being and becoming. And what your reply would be to like the small question, what is existence is grounded in? And it quite kind of modest because the opposite of modest is sarcasm because it is equal to the question about the ultimate essence of everything, which you know the answer, and it also reminds me about the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. So what is your reply?
Well, first of all, I'm given what my conception of the nature of existence is, I'm not sure that I'm at all happy that I exist, much less that you do. I think that existence is a lamentable affair at best, and the the only thing to be done with it is to regret it, and to engage with it as carefully as possible, so as to prevent it being exacerbated, both in our realities and in others. Yeah, I was thinking, I'm reading Jack Kerouac right now, and one thing that struck me in Dharma Bums is one of the major characters refers to human couples as grave makers, and I thought that was an apt way of thinking about what it is to reproduce, given the nature of existence. But yeah, I think the fundamental nature of my work is to push against what I call a kind of general metaphysical conservatism in contemporary metaphysics. This conservatism maintains entirely unjustified a kind of optimism in one form or another. Either an optimism that existence is a static being that continues on in eternity. We have that sort of metaphysics from Plato onwards. Or what is oftentimes opposed to it is a kind of metaphysics of becoming. But even in that metaphysics of becoming, this idea that there's perpetual change, perpetual transformation, there's this assumption that it is perpetual, that it goes on forever and ever. But of course, where does this come from, if not from some deference to the history of thought? In reality, when we try to understand the nature of existence as best we can through the tools we have available, we see that existence is anything but that. In fact, if anything, the whole of the testimony of the contemporary sciences for the last 200 years has worked against that viewpoint. There's been in those sciences an emergent thermodynamic revolution, which has radically transformed the way that reality is conceived within the material sciences in the last 150 years. And what it proves definitively is that first and foremost, existence is not organized towards infinitude. It's fundamentally organized around finitude. It's fundamentally organized around decay, corruption, rot, and ruin. And second of all, it indicates that the function of life therein, the function of all existent beings therein, is not to sustain themselves against this decay, but to contribute to it. And I think we can add to that for those of us who are granted by rotten luck sentience, an awareness of the nature of reality, an awareness of our own being, then not only are we doomed to know that it is finite and destined towards decay, we are furthermore doomed to know that everything we do contributes to it. And we experience this contribution both in our existence and in the existence of others as suffering. In other words, not only is existence fundamentally bent towards our own destruction, creating us merely to use us to destroy others and to destroy ourselves, we are destined to experience that destruction, in a word, as evil. So I think that contrary to the popular viewpoint that existence is a benevolence, that existence is flourishing, that existence is, in a word, good, I think existence is fundamentally evil. That is our best word within our human conception for it.
Perfect. You just replied to all of my questions. Um, the beautiful way to reply to the question about the ultimate essence of everything is the perpetual death or something like, or decay. It's like beautiful way, eloquent way of putting it. And it sounds insane, I'm sorry, and I really love it, but it's extremely scientifically grounded. Like
Mm.
that's the most scientific way of answering because we know it for sure with the second law of thermodynamics that it's totally what is going to happen and what is happening. And that's the interesting thing, that it sounds insane, but it's actually the least insane thing because it's very scientific and we love scientific. So maybe we should also discuss from the question that interests me is that in evolution and normally the way we perceive life, and it's another thing I'm grateful for, is that we see life as something that is opposed to decay, something that is opposed to death, but from, or it's this word, the negentropic, that is against entropy. And your claim is that it's not against entropy, but it's rather agent or embodiment of entropy. So it's not resisting death, it's rather not helping, but embodying death.
Yeah, both embodying. I mean, I think existence is a species of death, a species of destruction, or what we're calling death exists, I mean, is one way of talking about thermodynamic decay within the biological organism, right? So it is certainly a manifestation of, a result of, but it equally contributes to. And when you say this is my claim, I would defer humbly and say it's not my claim. It's the conclusion of the natural sciences within the last 150 to 200 years. I mean, we see this in everything from biochemistry, biophysics, contemporary physics, astrophysics. The fundamental assertion of all of these sciences is that the whole of reality is organized and ordered and fundamentally aimed at decay and destruction. And every object within that thing, though seemingly emergent, an emergent property of momentary stability, actually appears simply to accelerate that rot and destruction. So if all of reality is flowing downhill, it may at times appear that there are eddies of life, eddies of organization, eddies of meaning, for lack of a better word, that seem to flow backwards against it. But in fact, understood thermodynamically, if anything, they're there to circle back around and speed up the flow, right? So literally, if you think about everything that we do, we are less like a candle and more like a flamethrower in terms of contributing to the thermodynamic destruction of our environment. We cultivate plants to expending our energy to grow them. We then these plants are sort of absorbing nutrients from their environment, seemingly growing against the thermodynamic thrust, absorbing radiant heat energy to turn it into material energy. But then we use that energy, burning it back into heat energy. So it's all one big way of accelerating the process. Um, I mean, this is fundamentally the conclusion. And you're right. I mean, it sounds insane, but only from the perspective of our commonplace, conventional, conservative metaphysics. But if anything, those, precisely because they have no scientific ground, are what are in fact a leap of faith, a kind of momentary insanity in a kind of Kierkegaardian sense. Here's another way that I think we can talk about it. You know, Spinoza says the whole function of geometry, the whole function of mathematics and the sciences is to move from seeing things within the perspective of time, what he calls subspecies durationis, right? In order to see something from the perspective of eternity, subspecies aeternitas, right? When we see something from the perspective of eternity, he says, it transforms our understanding of the momentary appearance of objects, the momentary appearance of things. Now, Spinoza is working with a metaphysics of eternity. He fundamentally believes that things go on in perpetuity, constantly changing, constantly transforming in one form or another. We now know definitively that is not the case. Existence is moving towards one big burnout at the end of history, one big collapse into the totality of nothingness, whether it happens in the form of the big crunch, the big freeze, the the big what's the other one? We know that either way, at some point, the chemical bonding power of things will slowly dissolve and decay, leading to what is called the cosmological dark era, when literally no matter will even be able to exist, regardless of how the universe itself is functioning within space-time, right? So we know universe is burning towards nothingness. So Spinoza was wrong in that regard. But he is right that we can use scientific and mathematical and geometric methods to move beyond the appearance of things momentarily. So momentarily, it seems as if we give birth, we create, we build things. We are working against the entropic thrust of life. We are, in the words of Václav Havel, swimming upstream against entropy. That's what it looks like. But the whole function of mathematics, the whole function of science, the whole function of, I would argue, philosophy as well, is to transcend this perspective from the durational moment in order to see things from the perspective of eternity. And when we understand that the end of eternity is absolute annihilation, we understand that all of these things that seem to work negentropically against the collapse are actually working for the collapse, speeding up the collapse, moving towards nothingness, moving towards destruction.
So many beautiful ways to put it. Uh,
I don't know if I would call it beautiful.
no, yeah, it depends.
It's elaborate, it's horrifying, but
Or
it is the case, right? And I do think that our job as thinkers, as intellectuals, as theorists, as philosophers, as analysts, is to testify to the is, to testify to reality as it is. The next step is what do we do about that, of course. But this is simply testimonia, right?
to scare people,
To worry about the right things as opposed to the wrong things.
or just to worry. It also implies that we cannot avoid suffering, the similar perspective that life is not opposite, is not negentropic, it is entropy, which means that the way we experience reality, that suffering is not obstacle, not something to overcome, and there is no salvation from suffering, something we all hoping for, and almost all the religions are hoping for. It just means that this is how we experience existence.
Yeah, this is the is. This is what it is to be a sentient being, is to suffer. I think the problem is within the philosophical traditions in which the fundamental suffering of reality, necessitated suffering of reality, whether or not it's useful, right? Suffering. Levinas, I think, has a wonderful definition of evil. He calls it useless suffering. So suffering which has no function, no end, no aim. Just suffering which is necessitated by the function of reality itself. I think this is a perfect definition. In all the philosophical traditions that recognize this, they either, you're right, acknowledge that it's a problem to be overcome. We see this, for example, in the Buddhist traditions, or they simply acknowledge that precisely because it's inevitable, it's only our conception of it as a problem that makes it problematic. That somehow, this is Nietzsche, if we were to transcend the tragedy of our pessimism and embrace what he calls a sort of, Dionysian pessimism, which says yes even to the suffering, we can eliminate it as a problem. We can simply acknowledge it for what it is. I think both of these are wrong. It is essential. It is inescapable, but it is still a problem. It's just not a problem that can ever be overcome. So you're absolutely right that when we encounter the miseries of reality, it's false to think that this is somehow emblematic of some sort of a trauma, of something that needs to be gotten over. The only trauma that it's emblematic of is the trauma of existence itself. It is a necessary and inescapable condition to being for sentience. Perhaps, either death or the elimination of your sentience in one form or another, drunkenness, drug use. These are the only apparent solutions. But of course, they're only that. They only appear to be solutions.
And maybe we should start talking about evil. I like your humor in the matter of evil, where you claim that there is the good news. It's not that existence has no ultimate meaning and it's not meaningless. But this good news that it's not meaningless comes with the bad news. So, what is the bad news?
The bad news is that the meaning of life is precisely to suffer, right? So we have this idea that nihilism is somehow this fundamental problem of 20th century thought, that there is no meaning to life. And I want to say that one of the things that we can understand from the teleology that's given to us by the contemporary sciences is that nihilism is wrong. Good news, right? Meaning, existence fundamentally has a function, it has a purpose, it has an aim, and therefore it has what we might constitute a meaning. The problem is that teleology is a teleology of decay, a teleology of unbecoming, a teleology of rot, ruin, and destruction, which means that if there is a purpose, an aim to life, it is to contribute to these things. And if it is to experience these things, it is to suffer. So again, the good news is, yeah, life has a meaning. The bad news is it's worse than if it didn't have a meaning. Yeah? The bad news is the meaning of your life is not only to die. Yeah, you were born exclusively to die. I mean, we've always known that. But you were born to contribute to the ongoing death of everything around you. And in as much as we are doomed to experience that collapse, you are doomed to contribute to suffering. It's inescapable. Yeah.
So, the good news is that there is meaning, but oops, It's horrible. And this reply is even worse than 42 because and funnier because you want to know the answer. Now you know it, and it's better if you didn't. Or in general, it's better not to exist, and it's better to never been born than being born. There is a
Yeah,
humor.
if only we could content ourselves with the mystery, right? I mean, the big Douglas Adams joke with the meaning of life, the universe, and everything is 42 is precisely the idea that there is no meaning to life, or that it's so mysterious that it's incomprehensible by even the greatest computer. But in fact, it's so simple, it's stupid. It's so simple, it's obvious, even to the child in their awakening, nascent sort of consciousness of reality. Mommy, will you die? Right? Will I die? Right? Freud talks about this, right? The fundamental awareness, the traumatic moment of becoming aware of the directionality of life. It's obvious to the point of stupidity, and yet we will constantly wrap it in enigmas and mysteries in the hope of protecting ourselves from having to confront that fact. Yeah. Would that the meaning of life, the universe, and everything were 42?
So the existence is evil and terrifying. What is evil then? If evil is normally seen as obstacle to some kind of universal good, and from this perspective, um, it's just evil without any good.
I don't think it's without any good, but this is the thing, right? So it reverses our ontology of good and evil. So the classical definition of evil is as a privative, negative ontological relationship to goodness. So goodness is seen as what is, and evil is seen as the perversion, right? The errancy from the good. So the classic definition of this in Christian metaphysics, the concept of sin, to miss the mark, to err, to fall short of, right? If in fact reality is evil, then perhaps good can be conceived of negatively and privatively in this way. If evil simply is what is, right? If to be is to suffer and suffering is evil, if it's this useless suffering, I mean, useless in terms of our own fecundity and becoming, it's useful in terms of increasing the suffering of the universe, it's useful in terms of increasing the absolute destruction of all things, then I think it doesn't eliminate the possibility of good. It becomes the ground and the condition for the possibility of a new conception of good, where the good is conceived of as privative. The good is conceived of negatively. To wit, I think we can all of a sudden start to think of as good as anything which endeavors to resist the the necessary suffering of reality, to resist the entropic flow of reality, to resist the inevitable decay of all things into rot and ruin. Now, will it function? Will it work? Absolutely not. I mean, it's impossible to resist the laws of nature. I can jump out of my window and flap my arms as hard as I want, and that might be considered a good way of dealing with the inevitability of my collapse and crushing death on the pavement outside. But it's good to try nevertheless. And again, I think this is obvious to the point of stupidity, because this is perhaps precisely what we use to define what a good doctor is, what constitutes good medicine. So, for example, if I were to go into a clinic and say, Doctor, doctor, I've been shot, I'm going to die. If the doctor says, yeah, well, we're all going to die, that's the inevitable outcome of existence, so get used to it, we'd call that person a bad doctor. But a good doctor is precisely somebody who says, yes, I realize that this is the inevitable outcome of all things, but not on my watch, not today. First and foremost, we're going to get you into some palliative care. So, first and foremost, we're going to try to alleviate the suffering of that gunshot wound. Then we're going to try to stitch you up and remove the bullet so that you can go on to live longer. Now, does this actually functionally negate the entropic flow of the universe? No. I mean, if anything, it contributes to it, because now I'll go on to live a longer life in which I'll consume more, destroy more, and contribute to more suffering and death, both within my own life and in the life of others. But it's an attempt. It's an attempt to resist this thing. An attempt to say, okay, right now, in this moment, at this time and place, I'm confronted with the immediate and obvious effects of entropy, and I will do everything I can to stop it, right? So I would say that the good can be defined in this way, right? Precisely as this vain, ultimately unsuccessful attempt to kick back at reality, not in spite of the futility, but precisely because of the futility.
So this is how you define your ethics and ethical action as ethics of resistance. And in your book, Ethics of Resistance, this is what you write, that it's instead of submission to the absolute good, it's and considering evil as an obstacle to it. It's rather that you reverse the perspective, and the ethical position would be to resist the absolute good in this necessity of resistance. And this is when you use the figure of devil to mark this resistance, the demonic resistance, the necessity of demonic resistance. And you even call it a negative capability, which I appreciate. And it's about, and I appreciate how you use the metaphor of devil. Do you want to talk about devil?
Sure. I mean, the devil's a tricky figure, of course, to talk about for any number of reasons. I mean, first of all, it's um, almost a blank slate on which we've cast all of our fears and imaginations at different times in Western culture. So the devil's been figured in so many different ways. So I should sort of stipulatively define that the devil that I'm interested in that case is the devil that we get from a kind of Miltonian perspective. And I know that you and I have written back and forth on various ways in which the devil could be interpreted. So I like the devil as it's figured in Milton as someone who says no to the absolute rule and the absolute reign of reality as it's kind of constituted in Milton's imagination in the form of God, right? And in that regard, I think the devil is a sympathetic figure, right? We see the devil as actually working to establish some sort of counter regime, a regime which, as he says a glorious no to the absolute reign of what we might think of as tyrannical power established by that which is the divine. So I see in the devil, and we know he's destined to fail, right? He's ultimately a finite figure in light of the absolute and infinite power of the divine. But it's precisely in his efforts to establish a reign, precisely in his efforts to resist that regime, to establish a counter regime, that we admire him, that we think of the devil as yeah, as a sort of ethical model. So this is the devil that I'm talking about, right? And I know that there are different ways we can think about these things, right? And there's certainly like figures of the devil as a kind of primal demiurge, a kind of primal figure. In fact, Schelling has a kind of conception of the devil as emergent from his own sort of reading of the Gnostic tradition, where the devil is almost like a counterforce, a counterpower, the primal sort of motivator of a certain way of being that it's contrary to this other way of being. But I'm specifically thinking about it as a subspecies of the divine that uses divine power against itself, that bends the bow of its power to sort of shoot an arrow at its heart. And I think this is sort of the model of ethics I'd like to use, right? To use all of the energy that I can gain and muster from my contributions to the entropic collapse of reality to resist that entropic collapse.
Mhm. And in ethics of resistance, what you deal with is this idea of absolute good and how we're supposed to resist it. And I really love this. There's a lovely part in it when you compare Kierkegaard's Abraham with Hannah Arendt's Eichmann. It's like horrible thing to do because Abraham is seen as embodiment of a good person, as a tragic hero. But you see the similarities with Hannah Arendt's Eichmann, who embodies for us the most horrible person. So, do you want to elaborate on the similarities?
Yeah, I mean, and we can talk about that again in terms of our understanding of what metaphysics is. So in both cases, right, they deduce their personal duty from an absolute command. They use the logic of the absolute in order to justify their acts, right? So they say, well, this is the will of the state in the case of Eichmann, or this is the will of my God, and in the case of Abraham, and by the way, what difference is there between God and the state and the kind of modern imagination? I mean, I think this is precisely what so many kind of political philosophers and political theologians pointed out. And given the absolute directionality and the absolute reign of that will, they can instantiate what they see as their personal moral duty, right? So this is what it has willed, this is what it has stead, therefore this is what I should do. Therefore the fault lies not with me, but with the will. Thy will is mine, right? Thy will be done in the concept of the kind of Christian Abrahamic conception, or Eichmann's famous, I was just doing what I was told. I was just doing what the will of the state was. This will of the state be done in and through me, right? This precisely seems to me to be the logic which enables and justifies murder and horror, and makes us think that it's part of the everyday course of events. So similarly, if I say, well, and you hear this all the time, don't we? We hear people say, well, this is just the state of nature. Like lions eat lambs. The strong dominate the weak. We just consume. Like there's no point in being a vegetarian. We are fundamentally carnivores. Can't you see this? I mean, I don't think that's necessarily true, but we hear this sort of appeal to nature all the time as a way of justifying individual singular acts, right? But this is exactly, again, what Abraham does, what Eichmann does, and what every other act of evil has ever accomplished in the history of thought, in my opinion. Anytime you want to be complicit in this absolute system and justify the logic of the system as a way of just justifying your own actions, you are at risk of being complicit. I think goodness precisely comes from the opposite direction. When you acknowledge that this is the will of the system, when you acknowledge that this is the will of the absolute, or you acknowledge that this is the will of nature, the directionality of nature, and mustering again the courage of the satanic, you say, no, non servum. I will not participate in this absolute will. I will not strike a blade against my child's throat. Yeah? I will not contribute to the destruction, the useless, meaningless destruction of a people. I will not engage in acts of violence and destruction and domination, even if it's natural, even if it appears that that's the order and direction of nature, right? Because nature is an evil. The absolute will of the state is an evil. The absolute will of any divine commandment is an evil. Goodness can only come negatively in this regard. It can only come by resisting, using the strength and power of that edict to resist it, to say no to it.
So Eichmann wasn't satanic enough.
No, in fact, if anything, he was angelic.
Mhm.
Yeah, he's a perfect soldier in the war of the divine state,
Mhm.
as is Abraham, and as are so many of us in our everyday mindless consumption of things.
It kind of undermines also Hannah Arendt comprehension and hope, how evil can be defined, that it's simplicity and stupidity, and which is interesting thing because Eichmann is not stupid. At least he read Kant, and that's the minimum. So it's just inability to resist the absolute law, or to resist what is considered the sacred. Quite well, your conception of ethics, this means that it's the opposite of conventional conception of ethics. Maybe we shouldn't even call it, you shouldn't even call it ethics, because it's rather like the modest trick that you can play within the maybe impossibility of ethics.
Hmm.
But we can come back to it maybe. You also write about anarchism, and what is your, because there is this something about this resistance, similarity to this resistance in maybe certain reading of anarchism. Is there?
Absolutely. Well, really quickly, going back, I think one of the ways that Hannah Arendt defines evil is going with the flow, going with flow. This is a wonderful way of thinking about it if you want to kind of, again, take that up. If the thermodynamic flow of reality is towards death, destruction, and decay, then going along with the flow in any way, shape, or form, whether consciously and actively contributing to it, or simply passively letting it wash over you, in both cases is a kind of banality of evil, is fundamentally an evil. So I want to say again, ethics is always going to be resisting the flow. It's always going to be contra. It's going to be pushing back, pushing against. And again, you will not be successful. Make no mistake. Every effort to be good will fail. You can only contribute towards the evil of the universe. But the goodness comes precisely in the attempt, precisely in the effort, right? Another way we can conceptualize this before we go to the conception of anarchy, but this is perhaps a way of thinking about it, right? Is the wonderful Philip Larkin poem. We can think about it in terms of parenting. Philip Larkin, the English poet, has this poem called This Be the Verse, right? It starts off, and this is going to be explicit, so anybody who's under 18 should now sort of momentarily mute. But he says, they fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They give you all the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man, it deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. Okay, great. So we know that as parents, we are absolutely destined to fuck up our kids, to mess them up in one form or another. Does that mean we simply go along with the flow? Okay, well, if there's nothing I can do about it, I guess I won't try. Or does it mean that we consciously choose which ways we want to fuck them up? No, neither. It means that we actively resist the attempt to fuck up our children. We actively try to correct the ways that we were fucked up in our turn by fools in old style hats and coats, and actively work to keep them from getting fucked up in new ways. Will we be successful? Absolutely not. Your child will be fucked up as you and I were fucked up by our parents, and everybody has ever always been messed up by their parents. But a good parent is one who tries nonetheless, who doesn't go along with the flow of fuckery, but is constantly working against it. So here's how we can think about it anarchistically. Let's move anarchism out of the realm of politics and move it into the realm of metaphysics and ethics, right? If the arche, the overarching directionality of the universe, is towards this flow of fuckery, right? I feel like I've completely messed up your ability, Julie, to use this in any public forum. But if it's towards this flow of destruction, suffering, rot, and ruin, then the ethical action is always anarche, against that order, against that structure, right? And again, it is about as useful as me pushing against an immeasurable, I mean, a movable brick wall. I will do nothing against it, but it's in the effort to try to move it that I think the good can be defined. So you're right, the good becomes nothing. It becomes little at all. To use almost a biblical metaphor, it becomes a mustard seed in comparison. Yeah, it has no effective power. It's too tiny, it's minuscule. But it's in sowing it nevertheless that I think we can all of a sudden think about what virtue constitutes. So I think that goodness is always fundamentally going to be anarchistic in this regard. But again, a metaphysical anarchism, not necessarily a political anarchism, because political anarchism all too easily, at least within its tradition, becomes simply another arche, becomes simply another way of instantiating the flow of horror and destruction. And destruction. I mean, this is why, again, that I try to frame this within the light of resistance and not revolution, right? Revolution simply overturns the flow. It simply appears to look like it's coming from a new way, but it's just the same thing reiterated from a different perspective, right? It's the subaltern taking the position of the primary. But resistance means staying within the Minotaurian position and fundamentally working against it. Yeah, constantly shouting from the outside. So regardless of who the new regime is, we should always be shouting from the gates, non servum.
So instead of installing new absolute as after the revolution, it's rather, and here you use in this context, talking about anarchism, you talk about carving a negative space,
Mhm.
which I appreciate. I love word negative. So this is this work of negation, one could
Yes.
say, of resistance. Um, so it was half an hour when I was agreeing with everything. And in fact, you are probably the only one living and non-living actually philosopher with whom I substantially agree.
I'm so
Substantially,
sorry.
well, for now at least. But still, it's problematic move for me with ethics because it's still offering hope. I would rather apply the logic of impossibility of resistance,
Mm,
like the similar logic you apply to, or should be applied to life as not negantropic, as not resisting death, but it's within the death. So you do develop a conception of ethics as resistance and beautifully prove it how it can work relying on various philosophers. And the thing that I would agree is this second step after you provide the hope that there is something we can do, there is some way of being good, there is certain kind of trick that it's still quite hopeful. But I would agree with this rather, this is I wouldn't agree with, because I think we should apply this ethics, the comprehension of it as impossibility of being good. Um, but the third step, which is present in your work and when you're talking about it, but it also already comes as something that people might not notice, is that this attempt is always failed. It's always the absurd task. So rather, I would agree if you combine those two together, it's ethics, but it's impossibility of ethics. It's not preaching what we have to do, because this very preaching of what one has to do, the messianic position, is problematic, is leading you to. So this absurdity of it, resisting but failing to resist, none the way, the futile, it comprehending it as a futile attempt. I think so that you write about devil that is doomed to fails, and it's so pathetic because you cannot even be a devil.
Yeah, I mean, we can't even accomplish that well. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think we may, here will be my turn to agree with you. I think we may simply be disagreeing on what we mean by ethics, right? And this is again one of those tricky words. I think of ethics in the classic sense of a practice, an ascesis. It's an ethos. It's a way of life. It is an entirely hopeless way of life. So I think we fundamentally agree on that. So, what's the function of engaging in ethics? What's the function in committing myself to this useless, hopeless resistance, this futile attempt to push back against the flow of the universe? None. None other than that it gives my life a new sense of meaning and a new sense of direction. In other words, I can extract sort of disjunctively from the absolute meaning of reality that you are an agent of entropy, that you are contributing to the destruction of reality, and that in as much as you do, you are also contributing to your own destruction. And I can work to invert that meaning, sort of again, if we think the Aristotelian square of opposition in a disjunctive way, as opposed to a sort of deductive way. So it's simply a way of carving a new form of meaning, a new way of life, right? Will that new form of life or new way of meaning actually contribute to some transformative way of being? No, the Messiah will never come. But it still has, so to make this reference to the Messianic, but it still has a function nevertheless. There's a wonderful sort of midrash about the Baal Shem Tov that apparently the Baal Shem Tov was asked, would you still practice ethics? Would you still read Torah? Would you still obey the law, even if you knew with absolute certainty that there was no God? And of course, famously, the Baal Shem Tov says, I would obey it even better than I do now. Because if there was no God, if there was no goodness, if there was no function or meaning or hopefulness in engaging in these things, what else do I have to do than to engage in these sorts of little practices, which gives sort of an alternative regime, an alternative structure, an alternative path to making meaning out of my life, right? And again, it's an illusion, just like any other illusion, right? This idea that somehow it's certainly like anybody who thinks that you can derive from this some sort of smug comfort that, well, at least I'm not contributing to the entropic flow of reality. I'm a vegan. Is completely lying to themselves. Uh, so it's an ethics which does not give way to any smug satisfaction nor any hopefulness in the future, but it nevertheless gives a way of constructing an alternative meaning in your life than the one which you were destined for. Yeah.
Before your book taught me that it's an absurd task and the impossibility of ethics, the conventional ethic. It was my child who taught me that you can never be good. And maybe combined with the ethics of care, the feminist ethics, which is all about being involved into, for me, the ethics of care, feminist ethics, that one should care, is opposed to ethics, the conventional ethics, because unlike it's practical in terms that, unlike the what they call whatever the masculine ethics, which allows you the idea that you can be good, and for this being good you need to rely on certain theory, which means to step out of relationship, figure out theory, you subordinate yourself to, and then it's like this position of a god outside of relationship. And
Mm.
ethics of care, it just you embody it in the relationship. You have, there is no space, or it's just an illusion where you can step out and figure out what theory you subscribe to, whether, and figure out the way of being good. If you care, you in the moment, and you, and as a mother, you doing everything wrong, because with the problem of consequentialists. You don't know when to measure or who is measuring. It's all been involved, maybe trying to do it right, but the very attempt of trying it makes you evil, and you still need to do it without any theory. So you try to be good, but this precisely your attempt of being good, and that's the problem with being a parent. We do try, and probably every parent tried to be good, and that's precisely the way how they become evil. This is the way how they hurt and what they're going to be blamed for. And if you reverse, and that's a couple of examples that I know from my life, is that with next generation, you try to give your children whatever everything that your parents didn't give you, and that's how you become the special way you are evil, because this is what you're going to be blamed for. So there is no space to even analyze. It's a futile the very possibility of being ethical is quite futile. And yeah, so it's another form of impossibility of ethics. You try to be good, but this very attempt is failing, and it doesn't imply that you shouldn't try. It doesn't neither imply that you should try. It's just nothing that it implies.
I think that's it. You know, where I think we might differ just in our use of language is that it's impossible to be good. That's absolutely the case. One can only be evil. The structure of being is fundamentally bent towards this sort of this horror, this destruction, right? But the ethics is striving, creating a discipline nevertheless, a discipline to work against the mode of being, a discipline to work against the flow of reality nevertheless. So I would say that it is our sort of ethical duty, our ethical aim to work against it, though we know we can never be good, right? So being ethical is a way of utilizing the power of being in order to fight against the the telos of being. Futilely, again, you will fail. I think you're absolutely right that in many ways this ethics of resistance is that I sort of frame is absolutely tends towards an ethics of care. That caring is precisely, it's very much against the nature of reality and against the nature of the world. It is so I do think one way in which we can think about the possibility of goodness qua resistance is as a care. And in fact, this is something that Shannon Musset, who wrote a wonderful book called Entropic Philosophy, points out. So Shannon Musset is another one of the contemporary thinkers like myself who's trying to wrestle with the thermodynamic revolution. And in her work, Entropic Philosophy, she not only traces the history of the utilization of the concept of entropy across the history of thought, but she then ends with this sort of a very passionate plea for an ethics of care. Her argument is effectively that it is the finitude and the inevitable finitude and the inevitable destruction of reality which makes all the more pressing the need to respond to it with a sort of ethics of care. One way I also think about it is it's framed within a certain frame of a certain mode of Mahayanic Buddhism, which says that following up the the Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth that to be is to suffer. Within a certain kind of Mahayanic Buddhism, there's this sense that, well, therefore, it is our duty to become what it calls mothers of the world, mothers of the suffering being, suckling the suffering being of reality upon the sort of ultimately useless benevolence of compassion. So it's useless because they are still doomed to suffer, but nevertheless, you can palliative respond to that suffering with a kind of suckling care. Now, don't worry. Let me kiss it and make it go away. We all know that the kiss of the mother doesn't actually take away the pain of the injury, but it does soothe nevertheless. I think that is precisely the apex of ethical response to the horror of reality. Let me kiss it and make it better. Yeah. We all know it won't work, but it should be my effort. This is also, again, I think what the medical practitioner does. They're there. Let me give you a shot and heal your wound momentarily. I know it won't make the pain go away, but it'll momentarily palliative help you to deal with it so you can go on and to endure another day.
There is interesting English phrase because it just means nothing, you know, but it's helpful precisely by admitting that. I don't know, situating one in a situation they are, something like. So my
Sorry, just the meaningless. I'm sorry, Julie, just reminded me of something. This is a wonderful moment. Freud talks about, and I'm not sure exactly where this is, the child who's scared of the dark, and the parents who are trying to sort of wean it off of its needed for a nightlight. I don't know why they would need to wean the child off of a nightlight. I don't see what the problem of a nightlight is, but okay, but I'm not a Freudian. And at some point, the uncle comes to visit and stays in the same room with the child. And the child begs the uncle, I think it's the uncle, please speak to me. And the uncle says, why? And he says, because when you speak, the light comes on. I think that's it. In the horror of reality, in the horror of the darkness of existence, the meaningless phrase, the speak, the chatter, the whistling in the dark, as we say in English, the there, the kiss of the mother, it turns on the light. It doesn't actually ameliorate the horror. It doesn't actually illuminate the situation, but it metaphorically does. It metaphorically turns on the light. It metaphorically alleviates some of the horror of the darkness. Yeah, so you're right. It's a meaningless effort. It's a meaningless phrase, and it's meaningless to chatter away in a dark room as if it was illuminated. And yet, it helps us to constitute a counter meaning, nevertheless. It's ultimately meaningless, but in the moment, it gives us something to grip onto, to make an anarchy to the darkness.
Mhm.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just reminded of that in your comment, and I thought I should share that.
That's beautiful, but my way of thinking about my Satan and your devil is different from your devil in a way, because um, I see, well, I see it as a woman, as a mother, and it's about care. So for me, care and love and woman, mother would be not resisting entropy and evil, but would be the instance of it, maybe absurdly. This is how the evil is embodied in our, which means that humans are caring and loving, and that's why we love our children. That's why they stay alive for a while. But for me, in this very seemingly positive things is the essence of entropy, that they turn out whatever you touch with love is dying and there is nothing you can do. Like it works absurdly in this way as self-subverting things. So it's not, and it's, for me it's even more horrible because it not only means that there is nothing you can do and therefore you should do nothing, be nihilist or something. It means that you should, and plus it creates, you become this agent or embodiment of death. So whatever you love, you just kill with love. And one might say that you're supposed to, as a result of it, you're at least supposed to take responsibility of it. But what kind of responsibility? Because any responsibility is still trying to make it up and then still making it even worse. So
Mhm.
maybe you should take, there's nothing that follows from here what one should do, because if one is loving already and this is how one is killing with it, or maybe you're a better parent than me.
Oh, that's definitely not the case. I would say that, I mean, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. But again, this is where I think Spinoza's distinction between subspecies durationis and subspecies aeternitas helps us, right? So you're absolutely right. From the abstract, absolute perspective of the sciences, the perspective of eternity, as it were, every generative effort, reproduction, having a child, caring for the child, making sure the child survives, is not only ensuring is creating a grave, again, to use Kerouac's word, but it's contributing to the sepulcher destruction of reality itself. Your child is now an agent of entropy as well and will accelerate in their own personal environment. And the more of us there are, the quicker we'll get this thing done. So everything we're doing is moving us, accelerating us towards chaos, right? So you're right from the absolute perspective. And from that perspective, goodness is an impossibility. From that perspective, evil is all that there is. But disjunctively, within the moment, disjunctively, subspecies durationis, anarchistically, within the singular moment, I can attempt to fight against that slide by precisely caring, precisely by generative acts of love, precisely by doing these things. Now, in that moment, will it actually work to resist the arc of reality? Oh no, 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 no. That's destined. There is nothing you can do from that perspective. But in this moment, that is precisely my duty because it's actually working against the immediate appearance of that. So, for example, if I withdraw my care from the child and they sort of die a horrible death, starving, then that is accelerating the destruction. That is, in that moment, moving them quicker along the timeline towards their eventual demise. But if contrary to that, in that moment, I work to keep them alive, I work to nurture them, and I work to alleviate their suffering, which is the inevitable consequence of their having existed and being both the victim and the crime of entropy, then in that moment, in my care, in that moment, I am resisting. Right? Again, we know that resistance is only going to be a momentary sort of modality of the arche. So it doesn't actually, because again, by contributing that care, they live a longer life and they consume more and kill more. But it still is an effort at not making it happen. So this is again where I would argue entirely against. I mean, I think the real opposite of my position are accelerationists. People who would say, well, if this is the nature of reality, shouldn't we speed it along, right? Shouldn't I stop having children? Shouldn't I stop caring for the world? Shouldn't I just destroy everything around me? Shouldn't I consume as much as possible? Well, that's a manifest evil because, again, that's a direct deduction of my duties from the will of nature, in the same way that I think that Abraham and Eichmann do. But if the will of nature I recognize as an absolute evil, then again, in these concrete instantiations, any attempt to resist it is precisely a kick against, a futile kick against, as you pointed out, right? But it is that in that moment that the possibility of something like an ethical act takes place. So yeah, there's no good in any eternal sense, but there might be moments of something that appears to be good.
So the longer they live, children, the more they suffer, and this is what we have to support. There's also a joke that you should love your grandchildren because this is your revenge to your children.
Yeah.
But from the position of entropy, the very reproduction which is seen as resisting death, it can be seen as the dissipation or distribution of matter towards dissolution. You just make it more efficient. If the breastfeeding and feeding child is also the redistribution of resources, which is entropic. And mother, you can think about love and motherly love or parental love as self-negation or kind of death that you go through. So all of the things can be considered in this negative entropic way, something that we hoping that they are positive. They should be rather comprehended as sadly negative.
Ultimately, yes. Ultimately, correct. So one way you can think about it is if I am a cog in the entropic machine of the universe, when I have children, I'm just creating more cogs, which are more quickly distributing the energy downwards, more quickly sort of making the efficiency of the machine function. So you're right, from an ultimate and absolute perspective, again, subspecies aeternitas, from the perspective of that absolute perspective, it is not only not resisting, it is contributing, it is speeding up. But within the moment, it can manifest as something different. So you're right, it appears to be negentropic. It's not absolutely negentropic. Absolutely, it's entropic. But I want to say that's also where evil exists. Evil exists at the absolute level. Goodness exists only at the level of the apparent. So lean in to the apparent negentropic moment. That's care, protect, soothe, kiss away the pain, grow, create, do these things. Know it's our job as philosophers and theorists to know that in fact it's absolutely evil to do so. But it is better than the alternative of leaning into, accelerating, saying yes to the absolute order of reality.
There's interesting thinking in Bataille when he talks about resisting, like one need to be even worse than they are to kind of be even more destructive than they are destructive because it means that you want to direct destruction, you want to limit destruction when you're killing someone, for example. And instead, you should direct this destruction, make it more universal and direct it to yourself, include yourself in it instead of stepping away. And that's what anti-natalists do. They try to limit it or control it instead of those who are the opposite of anti-natalists are probably more anti-natalist probably than they
Well,
are.
again, depending on the way in which, or the sort of way in which you raise your children, I suppose, right? But I do see that as a point, right? Like the more radical, so the apparent position is a kind of the apparent response to the absolute evil of reality is a kind of quietism. Let me withdraw, let me limit, let me do as little as possible, extend as little energy as possible. I'll go away in a cave and I'll meditate until I die. I won't have any children, right? Again, the kind of Philip Larkin conclusion. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. This quietism has been the traditional response of those who've awakened, I would call it, and a sort of not unintentionally cheeky reference to Buddhism, but who's awakened to the pessimistic facts of reality. So a good example of this is Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer is the ultimate sort of foundation of this sort of anti-natalist withdrawal. Given the horrors of reality, the best I can do is to do as little harm as possible. Interestingly, there was another thinker who just after Schopenhauer was profoundly influenced by him, Philip Mainlander, who's I think just now beginning to be acknowledged and read a little bit more and translated in English. And he was profoundly influential to me in the writing of The Matter of Evil. And I provide a kind of rough translation and rough guide to some of his key thoughts. But he says, but actually, a real pessimism, a real radical pessimism, would go further than the quietism into a kind of radical activism, because it would recognize that given the horror of reality, I have to actively work
Mhm.
against these things. So I have to take the energy flow and bend it against the thing. So, right, don't just withdraw from the energy flow of reality toward dissolution. Embrace that dissolutive, take on the sort of normative responsibility of being evil, own your evil, yeah, and then do something with it. So instead of withdrawing into the cave and refusing to eat, continuing to eat, but starting to eat in an ethical way, eat in a way which says, I'm going to use this energy in a way that alleviates the suffering of others, or a way which attempts to sort of do as little harm as possible so that I can do as much good, again, good in the momentary thing, which I do think we agree that is a kind of a mode of care, a mode of sort of generatively engaging in reality. So you're right, the anti-natalist position, which is again just a kind of offshoot of this sort of Schopenhauerian quietism, isn't nearly pessimistic enough. It isn't nearly radical enough in its embrace of the absolute horror, because it still clings to the hopeful illusion that if I just withdraw, I can wash my hands and somehow smugly sit back and watch the rest of humanity march towards its inevitable decline. But not me. I'm on the sidelines, keeping my hands clean. But it's an illusion. It's a complete illusion, right? The much more radical thing is to own the inescapable horror of reality and use its horror against itself, right?
Right, it was around 1 hour, and I'm supposed to let you go now. Is there anything you want to say except for there?
I think the real question, and this is what I'm working on in my contemporary work, is how do we engage with the there? So you're absolutely right that I've got pictures. I've got a kind of metaphysics and epistemology worked out here. I've got an ethics and a pseudo politics worked out here. Pseudo politics because again I think that politics is a hopeless affair, but it's how we ethically engage in the political realm. But I think the really interesting question is if this palliative impetus, this there, is the height of our kind of ethical duty to care, what kind of aesthetics does that emerge? Because that's really an aesthetic moment. The there is an aesthetic moment of transforming the darkness into a kind of light, right? Again, metaphorically speaking. And so what I'm really interested in working on now is how this sort of lends itself to a new aesthesis, a new way of caring, of being moved and moving others in the world. And you note the comedic moments in these books, and I think comedy is a wonderful example of that. And to me, the real essence of comedy is precisely the sort of gallows humor that acknowledges the inevitability of my destruction and yet somehow giggles in the face of it nevertheless, right? That what we call again whistling in the dark, just to sort of to order my steps. So this is kind of where I think the next direction of my work is going, is towards an aesthetics of well, what I call an aesthetics of escapism, an aesthetics of these comedic moments that alleviate the tension, that alleviate the pressure, that give us some sort of palliative care. So aside from that, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to flout my sort of absolute misery on your subscribers and readers, and thank you so much for engaging so sincerely with these ideas, because you're right, they appear insane from one perspective.
You're always welcome. Okay, thank you, Drew.